But I think it's fair to say that Biden is scarcely less nationalist than Trump. He's just a bit more polite and diplomatic. Trump blocked appointments to the World Trade Organization's appellate body, and there's little sign that Biden aims to revive the WTO. I would also argue that China needs to have domestic reform. China has an extraordinarily high level of savings to compensate for poor social security system, for lack of bargaining power by labour in absence of trade unions, and power over the right to reside in cities.
Do you think that the foreign aid from the multilateral development institutions have been effective for inclusive economic growth in developing countries? When I say inclusive, I mean that poverty reduction along with the economic growth. My second part is like, if you say that it had been effective, like how can you quantify it if you have to measure it? Like, was it like you think?
Welcome, Professor Staunton. Professor Staunton is a professor in Cambridge, or has been a professor in Cambridge, but he still lives in Cambridge, and he's written a lot on economic history. He's an expert in the Industrial Revolution and thereafter, and he's very kind to talk about the politics of a plurilateral world. Are there lessons from history? Professor Staunton, we all wonder about lessons from history, or do we repeat history? So it would be very nice to hear your views. It seems to us that we're just repeating history all the time. We don't seem to have any lessons learned. We keep reliving the same thing over and over again. But it would be very nice to hear from you, very nice to hear your views on the post and the plurilateral world. It's a complex word, can't even say it properly. But yes, what are the lessons from history? So with that, Professor Staunton, I'll turn the mic over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you. And I think the invitation arose as a result of my new book, which is just out in the UK in May and came out in the States last week. It's a very, very long book. And I want to try and pick out some of the lessons from history for the present day, but I'm very much speaking as a historian. And as you may have seen on the cover of the book, I start the book in 1933 at the depths of the Great Depression, and I try to ask what was done then to resolve those difficulties. Are there any lessons for what we now face in the world? Well, since the book came out in April, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor to Joe Biden, delivered a major speech on what he called renewing American economic leadership. And that was building on the Inflation Reduction Act of August 2022. It triggered a discussion over what that new leadership would be. Could America provide leadership in a plurilateral world, or was that just a fantasy? On one hand, it could be seen as a turn away from the American commitment to multilateralism that marked American leadership after 1945 to a more polite form of economic nationalism than President Trump had espoused. On the other hand, Sullivan's speech could be seen as a pragmatic response between balancing domestic welfare within the United States with continued internationalism that had been undermined by the Washington Consensus, which had perhaps gone too far down the road of financial liberalization. Well, what Jake Sullivan was doing was calling for a new Washington Consensus under American leadership. How should those of us who are not American respond to that? Where should the global economic order go from here? Sullivan, in his speech, started from history. He started after the Second World War, arguing that at that point, the United States led, and I quote, a fragmented world to build a new international economic order. And he looked for a return to, and I quote, the core belief we first championed 80 years ago that America should be at the heart of a vibrant international financial system that enables partners around the world to reduce poverty and enhance shared prosperity. In other words, he was looking back to Bretton Woods 80 years ago. In his speech, he did identify many problems facing the United States. Many Americans were left behind. The financial crisis hit the middle class. How to respond to COVID, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and fragile supply chains, and of course, climate change. His solution was a modern industrial and innovation strategy based upon investing in sectors that are absolutely essential to growth and security, replacing tax cutting, financialization, privatization with a new policy of public investment. He wanted to move away from the belief of the Washington Consensus that trade-enabled growth would trickle down. And he said, however, that the solution was not just domestic autarky. It was to work with other countries to build a more durable global economic order, a focus on challenging reliance on China and to counter its Belt and Road Initiative, which, of course, Pakistan was part. He claimed that he was adopting an international agenda, but I think it's fair to say that Biden is scarcely less nationalist than Trump. He's just a bit more polite and diplomatic. Trump blocked appointments to the World Trade Organization's appellate body, and there's little sign that Biden aims to revive the WTO. Instead, he's using industrial subsidies to build a domestic coalition in support of a green transition. Despite Sullivan's claim, the Inflation Reduction Act lacks a wider global vision. Its approach is production within North America with subsidies and local content rules. Biden's need to secure support on Capitol Hill meant he was stressing national interest and hostility to China rather than the internationalism that was apparent during the Second World War and Roosevelt and Bretton Woods. What I want to do in my talk now is to pick up some of the points that were being made by Sullivan in his speech and to offer reflections as a historian on the nature of leadership in today's plurilateral world. What I want to start off by doing is to cast doubt on Sullivan's view that America provided a benign form of leadership after the Second World War. To Sullivan and to many others, America's leadership after the war was unproblematic. It was benign. It was creating, as he said, shared prosperity. Well, my book presents a much less benign interpretation of what the Americans were doing after the war. What Sullivan was doing was connecting with two very common themes, which we find in comments by economists and politicians. One theme is a frequent call for a new Bretton Woods. For example, at the World Economic Forum at Davos back in December 2019, Klaus Schwab said, I quote, "We need a new framework for global cooperation in order to preserve peace and to accelerate sustainable progress." After the Second World War, he said, leaders from across the globe came together to design a new set of institutional structures to enable the post-war world to collaborate towards building a shared future. So he wanted to do the same again. The second common theme we find in the literature goes back to Charles Kindleberger's idea of hegemonic stability, that the world prospers when there is one hegemonic power that takes responsibility. In his view, Britain provided that hegemonic stability before 1914, the United States after 1945. Problems, he argued, arose when there was no hegemon, as in the interwar period, and of course, there's no hegemon today. The United States might still be the world's largest economy, but not by a large margin, and will probably soon be overtaken. Now, in my view, in reading of history, these views are fundamentally mistaken. Even when the United States was such a dominant power after the Second World War, its hegemony was constrained. And his vision of the post-war order was not about the imposition of a carefully formulated and widely shared plan. Rather, it was shifting, contested, and deeply contingent. Let me just pick up some of those points. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, I argue in this book, was limited. It was limited to international monetary policy, and it was only possible because of contingencies at that time, which cannot, despite what Sullivan and Schwab and others are saying, cannot be replicated today. So let's stop talking about the need for a new Bretton Woods. That's a misuse of history. The Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 was only possible in certain geopolitical, electoral circumstances. First of all, it arose from the 1936 tripartite agreement between the United States, United Kingdom, and France, which is not only about stabilizing currencies, it was also about creating a bloc of liberal capitalist democracies against authoritarian regimes in the 1930s, particularly against Germany. That continues during the war with a wider coalition, including the Soviet Union and China, against Germany and Japan. It was argued that the Soviets, China, the United States, and Britain would form what was called the Four Policemen to run the post-war world. Again, Bretton Woods can only be understood in precise geopolitical circumstances. So let's not talk about a new Bretton Woods when circumstances are different. Thirdly, it was only possible to have the Bretton Woods regime in 1944 because financial markets were suspended and the power of finance was limited. The City of London and Wall Street have been constrained since the crash of the 1930s, and of course the financial system was actually suspended entirely during the war. That meant it was possible to have capital controls, and it was possible then to set domestic interest rates without provoking post-war capital inflows and outflows that would undermine paid exchange rates. Not surprisingly, the American Bankers Association was deeply opposed to the Bretton Woods Agreement. And finally, the Bretton Woods Agreement was only possible because it concentrated on monetary issues and left out other issues, particularly trade. Trade issue divided the British cabinet during the war. There were people on the one side who were deeply protectionist, the supporters of imperial preference, and on the other side, those who wanted a wider Atlantic free trade economy. Churchill did not want to talk about it because it would divide the coalition. Similarly, in the United States, Harry Dexter White, the author of the American proposals for Bretton Woods, wanted to have economic development, particularly for Latin America, but again, he dropped that for pragmatic reasons because it was too difficult to talk about during the war. So I'm arguing that let's not talk about Bretton Woods being revived. It could only happen in certain circumstances. Furthermore, I would say that American hegemonic power was deeply constrained. American leadership was constantly shifting, being adapted, and being contested. We have to understand what was happening during the Second World War in terms of a wider debate that had been taking place at the League of Nations in the 1930s. Different views about the nature of global economic governance. And those debates did not disappear at Bretton Woods and in the post-war debates. So what were those debates going on at Bretton Woods over what the nature of a new global order should be? One view was associated with Hayek, what I call the Geneva liberals. They argued that a superior political power was needed to protect the global economy from the misuse of sovereignty by nation states. They believed that nation states would harm prosperity. To Hayek and others, the economy was spontaneous, unknowable, should be left to work within a framework of laws that would guard what they called providential planlessness. They rejected planners who would be tempted to adopt what Hayek called totalitarian methods of economic management. So in their view, international organizations should set rules which constrained individual nation states and prevented the extension of state planning to the international level. However, there was a second theme, which I think became more powerful within the League of Nations, which is what I call positive security. And this was led, above all, by Australia. At this point, many other countries which would be arguing for such policies were still colonies and didn't have a voice. But the Australians at the League of Nations were arguing that it was necessary to have policies which were about nutrition, about food, to demonstrate that democratic countries, they said, can achieve for their people greater comfort and well-being than can the fascist and communist states. This meant working with the International Labour Organization to create minimum wages, social insurance, and income distribution, and working with the League of Nations in order to create better nutrition for all people in the world, which would create markets for the products of primary producing countries, would raise the standard of living and well-being of everybody in the world by better nutrition, leading to better productivity and efficiency. Some of this was actually being carried out within India, within the Kunar Research Institute. But also here within the League of Nations, we find the future Nobel Prize winner James Mead arguing in his book, The Economic Basis of a Durable Peace, that there should be international regulation of economies, control of commodity prices, international public works, and a coordination of national credit. Exactly what Hayek and the Geneva liberals did not want. So in my book, I argue that this second approach, positive security, was a very powerful influence running alongside the Bretton Woods debate over purely monetary policy. And there were two wartime proposals, conferences. The first was at Hot Springs, which dealt with food and agriculture in May and June 1943. This argued for buffer stocks to stabilize primary production, to raise consumption, to deal with malnutrition. It went beyond monetary stability, beyond multilateral trade, to remove global imbalances. And as I say, that had an input from nutritional scientists within the British Empire, but was also picked up by Gandhi in India, working with William Ackroyd Wallace Ackroyd, rather, at the Kunar Institute. The second conference was the International Labour Organization meeting at Philadelphia in April-May 1944. Its new charter contained a commitment to economic growth, to full employment, to higher standards of living, to full utilization of the world's resources, to avoid economic fluctuations, and to assist less developed countries. The Australians, particularly here, argued for full employment of the resources of the world, which was necessary as a complement to the Bretton Woods monetary regime. They said that if countries are going to give up the power to adjust exchange rates in response to economic depression, then it was necessary for the Americans to stabilize their highly cyclical economy. If others were to become dependent upon a multilateral economy, it was necessary for the Americans, the dominant world economy, to prevent depression themselves at home. Now, at Bretton Woods, less developed countries, primary producers, tried to insert those ideas, but they were pushed back. The Indian delegations, and of course India was still part of the empire before partition, they wanted action on the sterling balances which had been built up as a result of providing goods, material to the British during the war. The Indian delegations wanted to use those balances of sterling to fund post-war development. One of the representatives at Bretton Woods was Schroff of Tartar, who had been one of the authors of the Bombay Plan. He wanted to release these balances for a major policy of post-war economic development. At Bretton Woods, Keynes initially promised to do that, but I would say don't trust a Cambridge economist, because as soon as he got home, he tried to renege on that, or did renege on that deal. So what we have here is a very serious debate going on with the Indian delegations pressing for the use of of economic development, the balances for economic development, and then the government of India, the British government of India, prior to independence, accepting the Bretton Woods Agreement without consultation of the Legislative Assembly. This led to complaints from India and Pakistan of treachery, an Anglo-American conspiracy to give priority to American debts over British obligations in the former Raj. So the experience of Bretton Woods, of India and Pakistan, led to what one historian has called a foundational ambivalence towards a new liberal international order. Also at Bretton Woods, the Australians were again pressing their policy of a commitment to full employment. These views were not adopted, and also China, the nationalist delegation at Bretton Woods, wanted to adopt Sun Yat-sen's approach of international support for development. Well, those pressures didn't work at Bretton Woods, but those ideas of positive security could then return in the post-war talks on trade. The International Labour Organization conference in Philadelphia led to an agreement by the Americans that post-war discussion should be both on trade and employment. The Americans only want to talk about trade, but they had to give in to this wider definition of trade and employment. In other words, their hegemony was being constrained. The Conference on Trade and Employment was held at Geneva and Havana in 1947-8. The Americans wanted to create an international trade organization which would set out rules on both trade and employment. But yet again, it led to contested definitions of what is meant by multilateralism. It meant a widening of the agenda under the influence of less developed countries, which went beyond what the Americans wanted. The Americans at Havana were led by Will Clayton. Will Clayton was an advocate of multilateral open markets. He believed that that was the starting point, that would lead to growth. And it was not necessary to start with policies to stabilize the economy. That would lead to inefficiencies and end creative responses to economic downturns. So the Americans were pushing that agenda. But against that, we have others stressing full employment. So the British had a commitment to full employment during the war for domestic reasons. They said full employment was absolutely necessary before trade barriers could be reduced. So the British were arguing that. But then the Indian delegation at Havana went far further. They said that if there was going to be a protection of infant industries within India, then the necessary result of that was unemployment in the developed countries, whose markets would be affected by competition. Primary producers were also looking beyond stabilizing commodity prices, which is what the British and Americans would accept, to increasing commodity prices, which would not be welcomed in London. So again, different definition going on here. But above all, at Havana, the Latin Americans were pressing for dignified existence for all workers, an end of sweating of labour, the end of substandard conditions in export industries. And furthermore, also wanted to ensure that profits from natural resources would go to the countries where those natural resources were based. rather than to foreigners. So all of that was a threat to the Americans. And Will Clayton was in great difficulties. If he was going to be able to get commitment to sign the charter in Havana, he had to give in to those demands. But this was a two-level game. In giving in Havana, making concessions to secure the signatories from less developed countries, he was losing support on Capitol Hill. The result of this was that the Charter of the International Trade Organization was never ratified. So what I'm suggesting here is that American hegemony after the Second World War was very constrained. Despite its economic power, it was forced to compromise and adapt. Let me take that point further. It wasn't able to get its own policies adopted in Europe. It had a deeply misunderstood view of the speed with which Europe would recover. And in May 1947, Clayton visited Europe and saw that it needed a lot of aid. He therefore argued that it needed a customs union within Europe. Without a customs union, Europe would descend into chaos. That seemed to be going against what he was arguing for in terms of his open multilateral trade. But he realized that it would not be possible to have a recovery of trade without the Europeans having a customs union. And he said that was then to be complemented by the International Trade Organization to prevent that becoming economically nationalist. So he was trying then to have a balance between these two views. It was a fundamental shift from what the Americans had wanted to do during the war. The Americans also had to give in to allow Britain to keep imperial preference. And it led to a fundamental change then in European policy, which goes along with a fundamental change in the Cold War, the abandonment of the four policemen policy. The Soviets pull out during the Second World War. President Roosevelt and Henry Morgenthau, the Treasury, wanted the Soviets to be in. They come out. So I think there's a fundamental shifting going on here within the policies being put forward by the United States. The policies being adopted are also largely excluding the global South. After the failure of the International Trade Organization, where the policies being pressed by the global South were not being adopted, the theme of full employment was taken up in another venue of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. In 1949, Pakistan was one of the countries pushing for a redefinition away now from full employment, which they said was a concern of developed economies, to underemployment, that underemployment could only be solved by development. So pressure coming here, the Bandung Conference of 1955, of course, being part of that. And that putting the Americans in a very difficult position. If they rejected those demands, it played into the hands of the Soviet Union. But if they accepted all those demands, it would undermine support domestically. So I think here, again, I see a fundamental change, or fundamental debate within the United States at this point, what to do about it. Kennedy turns to the Alliance for Progress, the UN development decade, to try and create development on American terms. There's also the strategy of the economic historian Walt Rostow, who argues that in the process of economic development, the dangerous point for the point of view of the capitalist developed countries is the transition from tradition to modernity and the takeoff into self-sustained growth. During that phase, it was necessary to have military action to prevent that tension, that pointed to the transition, being exploited, as he saw it, by the communists. Another policy adopted by Nixon and Kissinger, particularly in response to the OPEC price shock of 1973 and the new International Economic Order of 1974, was to what they called fuzz it up. That is to say, not to adopt what they called a theological position, a rigid ideological position, but instead to make supportive noises and to pick off individual countries. And that contrasts with the French policy, which was to try and act as intermediaries with the less developed countries. So a dialogue, the North-South dialogue, which is picked up by Willy Brandt. So I think there's a big debate going on within the United States administration over exactly what to do about this threat, as they saw it, to the power of the West. So in this book, at great length, I analyse all of these debates. And my conclusion is that the experience of Bretton Woods, of the Bretton Woods system, if we can call it that, is not about an ideal of harmonious international institutions that can resolve disputes. It's about muddle, compromise, adaptability, geopolitical power. The Bretton Woods regime was only adopted in 1958, when convertibility was finally adopted. It was only kept alive by temporary fixes, by management, not management by the International Monetary Fund set up in 1944, but instead management more by the Bank of International Settlements, which is meant to be abolished at Bretton Woods. The Bank of International Settlements working with central banks through swap networks. At Bretton Woods, Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, had wanted to remove the power of central bankers, remove the power of finance, but in fact is coming back in. Is coming back in also within the World Bank. The World Bank, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, was initially meant to carry out some of the more progressive ideals of the New Deal, men such as Lachlan Curry in Colombia. But in fact, the Wall Street bankers take over. They only want to fund self-sustaining, self-supporting policies rather than investment in social infrastructure, education, public health. So on my reading, the lesson to be learned as we now face current challenges is that we shouldn't be pursuing, as Sullivan, Schwab, and others suggest, what I see as being a fantasy of an inclusive, cooperative institutional structure. What we need to do is to accept that the outcomes will always be contested and muddled now as they were in the past. So let me now turn to the present. I think historians have very good 2020 vision looking backwards. I think we're not so good at looking forward. But then one could say, who is going to be very good at looking forward at the moment? So Sullivan is calling for renewed American leadership. Well, if American leadership was not really possible even in 1944 or after 1945, is it going to be possible now when it is not such a dominant economic power? Sullivan is casting American leadership for domestic reasons as a response to dependence on Chinese supply chains, as a response to the Belt and Road Initiative, as a response to plans for BRICS. In other words, he's casting it in a contestation, confrontation, rather than cooperation. Is that the right response to be adopted by the United States and other countries? Well, there are different interpretations of what Sullivan and Bidenomics and this call for American leadership means. On the right, within the United States, it's seen as dangerous as being an inefficient abandonment of market logic, that it will be costly. It will lead to higher debt rather than growth. The Inflation Reduction Act piling up more debt, undermining free competition. On the other hand, there's a progressive view, which is that it is actually yet another triumph of neoliberalism. That what actually it is doing is providing subsidies to private investment, de-risking private investment through extended private-public partnerships. whichever one of those views is right, there's a danger that the Inflation Reduction Act will provoke trade wars with China and with the European Union. Is it actually the solution to the problems facing the world, or will it lead to a renewal of beggar my neighbour policies and economic nationalism that marked the 1930s? We must also be very careful here that during the Cold War, which as I was briefly alluding to a moment ago, it was possible for the Soviet Union and the United States to be at loggerheads in geopolitical power at a time when their economies were not closely integrated. That is no longer the case. The United States and China might be geopolitical rivals, but their economies are still nevertheless deeply integrated. What I would like to argue is that the Inflation Reduction Act and this call for new American leadership should be understood in terms of what is practicable in the current state of American domestic politics. We shouldn't be looking for something that is better and unrealizable. So the European Union might engage in a trade war or subsidy war with the United States. But would that be wise by the European Union if we try and analyze why the United States, by Biden, are acting in the way they are? So I would like to look at a little bit of reality here. The United States government is not committed to rules-based trade system in the way that it had been before, during and after the Second World War, but of course it was the major trading power. The European Union needs to be committed to rules because it needs to have the rule of law to hold together its 27 member states. On the other hand, in the United States, horse trading is needed in Senate to secure support from Joe Manchin in West Virginia or to win over swing states such as Ohio and Michigan. For domestic reasons there, it's necessary for Biden to engage in that sort of pork barrel politics within the United States. We need to understand his political realities and accept what is feasible. The nature of United States politics means that there is little room for anything else. American leadership needs to be understood after 1945 as constantly shifting and contested phenomenon within domestic politics. The crucial point, I would also say, is that we shouldn't start off by looking for international cooperation. We should start off by looking for domestic reform. If there is one lesson to learn from history after the Second World War, it is that international cooperation by countries like the United States, Britain, and the European countries rested upon a particular domestic balance between capital, labour, and the state. It was only as a result of that form of social contract, if you like, at home, it was then possible to sell internationalism. And I think that is one of the crucial points I would make today, that without domestic reform, both in the United States and China, it will be impossible to create balance within the global economy. So let's look at that point now in the last 5 minutes or so of my talk. So let's look at the United States. In the Bretton Woods era, in the United States, in Britain, in Europe, workers were limiting themselves to modest wage demands. Capital earned a decent profit. There was reinvestment in higher productivity. The state provided better schools, healthcare, and social support. That social contract was underwritten by Fordist mass production that provided secure employment to workers who often lacked formal educational qualifications. There was historically low inequality and modest inflation. That social contract collapsed in the 1970s with stagflation. And from the 1980s, profit margins widened without necessarily much improvement in investments in productivity. Incomes of many workers is squeezed. Forwardless mass production collapses so that those people who lacked formal education lose out. Stagnant incomes for many families within Britain and the United States meant credit expansion in order to maintain consumption, and Chinese purchase of American treasuries also to maintain consumption. Now, I would argue that in order to get support against a sort of Trumpist populist attack upon internationalism, one needs to reform that domestic political system. The Inflation Reduction Act is not making much of a step in that direction of domestic reform. I would also argue that China needs to have domestic reform. China has an extraordinarily high level of savings to compensate for poor social security system, for lack of bargaining power by labour in absence of trade unions, and power over the right to reside in cities. The result is low domestic consumption, unproductive investment in infrastructure and property as a crucial part of economic growth, which we're now seeing as leading to serious problems. There's a reliance upon exports. Now, I would argue here that there's a need to encourage domestic Chinese consumption by improving the social welfare system, increasing the bargaining power of labour. If we can have reform of the domestic economies of both countries, that then starts to solve the global imbalances between those two economies. And I here follow the recent book by Matthew Klein and Michael Pettis, Trade Wars are Class Wars. We need to have a change in both the domestic economies of China and the United States to remove disequilibrium within those two countries, and that therefore then also lead to disequilibrium within the global economy. So let's not talk about creating American leadership within a plurilateral world until we fix those problems. I would also argue that we need a polycentric approach, that we should not be, or Sullivan should not be talking about American leadership. The role of international institutions is limited. I've been suggesting that the IMF did not play a major role even during the height of the Bretton Woods regime, that the role passed to the Bank of International Settlements. In the recycling of petrodollars, it was mainly left to commercial banks rather than to the IMF. So I think that the role of the international institutions should not be exaggerated. We shouldn't be looking always there for the solution. I think a mistake was made with the World Trade Organization and the Doha Development Agenda. Again, a misreading of history. The International Trade Organization failed because it tried to do everything. The World Trade Organization Doha Development Agenda failed because it tried to do everything. It's better to start off with a solution which is on particular issues where one can create a consensus, at least between some people. What the Bretton Woods history shows is that fully inclusive multilateral institutions never really existed in any meaningful sense at any period. They were always limited in coverage, always worked alongside other bodies. The Bank of International Settlements, the OECD, the G20, the G77, the G7. So the lesson of history is it is better to proceed as a coalition of the willing, of like-minded countries reaching plurilateral deals on particular topics that can then be extended. I argue in the book that what we need is messy multilateralism of flexible networks that recognise state sovereignty and build agreements between willing partners. And I think the person who put this well in 2018 was the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, who was then chair of the G20 group on global finance. He called for a new cooperative international order based upon variety of venues in response to specific problems. And that idea is picked up by Eleanor Ostrom, the leading theorist of collective action. She said that what we need is a polycentric approach, which is more likely to succeed than a sort of international agreement which was reached at Bretton Woods, which, as I said, was very limited. We should act on all sorts of different levels, from the local, the national, the international, where appropriate. My book was reviewed by Adam Tooze in the Financial Times. And he said that my book is what he called disillusioned. In other words, I don't have any illusions about the ease with which it is possible to create international cooperation. He said that what is needed, and he was picking up my argument, that what is needed is an ad hoc agenda for problem-solving action. He said, rather than clear rules and norms, it entails a massive decisions and policy choices. These will entail conflicts and demand politics and diplomacy. In the light of the urgency of our polycrisis, that is a healthy disillusionment. It is a sign that economic policy is catching up with reality. So in other words, what we need to look at is messy ways. What I look at in my book is how American leadership was actually deployed, not through hegemony, but by constantly shifting interplay between ideas, geopolitics, domestic electoral calculations, interest groups, changing economic structures. We shouldn't be looking for a nostalgic, hegemonic, order-centric view of the governance of the world economy. We should be accepting that the reality is one of improvisation and makeshifts. The Bretton Woods regime was not an established fact, it was a process. Insofar as it mattered, it was because it was a vision of something to aim towards. It was associated with attempts to balance domestic welfare with multilateralism, aiming to limit capital flows, aiming to subordinate finance. It was about aspiration. It was about the pursuit of a project by constant adaptation through conflict as much as cooperation. And I think the same applies now. I think what we need to guard against, however, is that we don't have the blocks emerging. We don't have an American leadership against BRICS group. We need to accept that it's messy. We need to work where we can, with whom we can, which means constant process of debate and discussion, and not the pursuit of a nostalgic world which never existed. Thank you.
Professor Staunton, thank you very much. That is a very, very, very good review of the economic developments, multilateralism, how the Bretton Woods institutions worked, etc., and how things have happened. I think you're absolutely correct that there has been a muddle-through approach. It has been an evolving system, and you're right, we need to muddle through more. But now let's think about it slightly differently. Yeah. Yes, there are the big powers who are taking the decisions. Little people are organized in G22, G70, whatever X things, and we have these conferences and things. But there is another agency that's now kind of crept up over time, which doesn't affect you where you sit, but which affects us a lot, which is the global bureaucracy. The global bureaucracy. The UN system, the Bretton Woods system. I mean, there's a ton of bureaucrats now out there. And one thing that has crept up over time, which wasn't envisaged, is the aid situation, which also has the global bureaucracy. So in a sense, where I sit, and the difference between where you sit and where I sit is, we are much more affected by the global bureaucracy than you. And, you see COP28 happening now. So, in fact, quite frankly, I used to be the Minister for Planning, and I must confess that we are inundated with these agendas. We don't have the capacity to deal with these agendas. We have no idea on how to deal with the many, many agendas that are being forced upon us by the global bureaucracy. And even though the big powers, US, etc., may not be playing a big role in it, but there's an autonomous agenda sitting now that's also happening. And so, A, I would like you to react to that. Two, I think, quite frankly, what has happened also is that despite what Hayek said, The global bureaucracy and the way things are going now towards are much more non-market interventions. We are much more focused on developing a welfare state, and especially now we are trying to impose welfare standards in almost all countries. So we are departing from market conditions. Similarly, we are departing from, even in multilateral trade, we are departing from free trade to trade restrictions, as well as multilateral and free trade agreements, between bilateral agreements. So there's a messy regime that is emerging, and nobody seems to have the intellectual wherewithal to challenge this. There's no Keynes around who can kind of take the system up. And the system is happening on its own. To me, it's a very, very welfare-oriented, we bleed for the poor. Now, the poor of Pakistan, for example, have a constituency in the global order, not locally. And the health has a constituency in the World Health Organization. So where does that fit into your scheme? Does the global bureaucracy fit in anywhere, or do you think the global bureaucracy doesn't have a mind of its own? It's controlled by who?
Yeah. Well, those are excellent questions, and thank you very much. Now, whether I can answer them, I'm not sure. I was invited to give a talk about my book at the World Trade Organization in Geneva about a month ago. I can certainly say that there was certainly a very big bureaucracy there. What struck me was that they felt rather, how can I put it, lacking in effectiveness. And I think that a point which came out in my discussions there was that the World Trade Organization was measuring, as they thought, the effectiveness of preventing tariff warfare, trade warfare, but they had failed to measure subsidies. So the point they were making there was that the bureaucracy was rather limited in what it could do by the interest of individual nation states, so that they were always prevented from measuring the real thing which was happening in the world, which is subsidies, like the Inflation Reduction Act. So they felt rather at a loss about what to do, felt powerlessness, I suppose. The global bureaucracy setting the agenda. I suppose that's part of the continued a sort of almost neo-colonialism, one could say, about what is happening. The debates over conditionality, which I talk about in my book. So yes, who is setting the agenda? Who is setting the power there? I think that the debates going on at COP28 at the moment are part of that argument of how far there should be a payment by the global north to the global south for the damage that has been caused to the environment by past economic development. So I think that there's a need to have that sort of debate going on. I suppose to the extent that some of the arguments over why did the agenda take part, like I was arguing over the development decade in the 1960s, is an attempt by the Americans, above all, to say that yes, we need to take account of the views of the less developed or emerging markets, but on the terms set by the Americans. I think that's a theme within the book all the time about how these debates are going on within these organisations. Spent a lot of time looking at the Royal Prebish and UNCTAD against the GATT as it then was, and against the IMF, how to insert those ideas. And I think that's a debate which has been going on since 1944, where I'm arguing about these books, and one which continues to go on. So I think that, yeah, you're highlighting those issues, and I think that I need to think more about it.
Yeah, Dr.
Shahid?
Saab, thank you, Martin, for an informative lecture. I do have a couple of questions. It's interesting that you mentioned the Soviet Union. You made this comparison of Soviet Union with America, and you said that they weren't that engaged, or they weren't trading that much. Let's just say,
Yeah.
let's just put it that way, right?
Sure.
So it was different, but and you said that it's a different in case of China and US. But I'm just wondering whether their relations or their engagement, China and US, would that be able to prevent a conflict over Taiwan? And
Yeah.
I mean, given the hawkish nature, I would say, of administrations, at least in Donald Trump's time. I'm not sure about Biden, but would that be able to prevent? And especially even in Biden's term, when they have come up with legislations like, I don't exactly remember the name, but the one where they are incentivizing manufacturing of microchips within the
Yeah.
United States and decoupling from China. So would
Yeah.
that be able to prevent a conflict over Taiwan? Second, when you, I'm just wondering how the Ukrainian and Russian conflicts, and now the Israeli and Palestinian conflict, especially the Ukrainian and the Russian conflict, would that fasten or hasten the multipolarity drive or the multipolarity incentive in the world? What would we probably see in the next 5 or 10 years? These
Yeah.
are two questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Really, really good question, which I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, looking at it as a historian, it was often said before the First World War that because the German and the British economies were so closely integrated, there could never be a war. Well, it was soon found out in 1914 that there could be a war, that countries could be economically integrated, but geopolitical rivals, which could then lead on to warfare. So yeah, I mean that is a serious issue over Taiwan. As I said, the Soviet Union, as a state trading power, it was hoped would be incorporated within that Bretton Woods regime. That they would be in the IMF, they would be in the International Trade Organization, which would cover state trading power. That didn't happen, and they largely go their own way, except to the extent that the Soviets were earning dollars from some sale of raw materials and oil, which they, of course, they didn't want to hold within New York because that was potentially be seized, let's say, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So those dollars were held offshore in the euro-dollar market. So there was a degree of relationship there between the Soviet Union and the United States, but very, very sort of limited in that way. China, the United States, you've mentioned the CHIPS Act, the attempt to create more capacity to manufacture chips within the United States, to be less reliant upon Taiwan, with the threat that Taiwan would possibly be affected by Chinese military action, is an attempt to uncouple supply chains, both with China and with Taiwan. I was at an event recently where a leading expert on China and geopolitics said there was a better than even chance of conflict over Taiwan. I'm not so sure about that. I think that would be mutually destructive for China and the United States, but who knows? Looking at it as a historian, my mind goes back to 1914, when there were so many potential triggers for where a geopolitical conflict on a global scale could happen. And I think we're in the same situation now. That in a way, the Cold War was a stable power balance. Now there could be triggers anywhere. You mentioned Ukraine, North Korea, what is happening in the Middle East at the moment. It only requires one misstep, one misaction for something to happen, however integrated the economies of China and the United States might be. It also depends upon whether Donald Trump wins the election next November, whether President Xi remains in power or is perhaps being challenged internally as a result of the tensions there. Keynes was mentioned a moment ago, that we need another Keynes. Well, Keynes said in 1933 that we live in a situation where we're perplexed. So Keynes in 1933 said the whole situation of the world was one of perplexity. And I think that if that's true in 1933, it's also true now.
Yeah, Professor. Some of my question was already answered when Dr. Nadeem asked about it. But my specific question is that where do you think the South stands in the face of multilateralism everywhere? Like you see the Paris Climate Agreement, that is a binding factor. SDGs given as a framework, every country has to follow. Now there are the base erosion and profit sharing models in which the taxation is also taken at a global level. So the South is basically compelled towards a system in which really they don't have any stakes, or they are kind of forced into accepting it. So what chances do they have in the coming future that they can remain outside this kind of a new global order, where the face of multilateralism is basically beneficiary towards a few countries which are already developed, and the South would always be basically lagging behind?
Yeah. Sorry, my sound system wasn't working very well. I'm not sure I caught everything you said, but basically you're saying that the South doesn't really have the voice. That the system is still.
Basically, Professor, what he's saying is that the South seems to be losing agency in this system, where there are international guarantees, agreements, etc. So things coming our way which we have to comply to, FATF and all these new tax arrangements and things.
Yeah, I think that's right. Very often, what I think I see happening in the book, every time the agenda is being set by the global institutions, is set on the terms of the global North. So the World Trade Organization going for intellectual property rights and that sort of issue. How to insert the voice of the global South within these debates, I think, is very. I'm not sure I can say how to do it now. I think that what I argue in the book all the time is constant attempts were being made to do that. I mentioned Bandung, the UNCTAD debates, the new international economic order after 74 failing in 1981. How to get those voices inserted? I think there's a question of what is the strategy to be adopted. I think sometimes what I see happening is an attempt to create a coherent ideological position for the global South, like in UNCTAD. And I'm not quite sure that works, because the attempt to create a single, if like, ideological claim for a rebalancing of the world's economy, which of course is needed, could then act as a barrier to, if like, pragmatic solutions by negotiating with individual countries over individual issues. So I just wonder if that's more the way to proceed, not through an attempt of the G77 or the new international economic order, but to work pragmatically by working on particular themes where one might be able to strike a balance. I don't know if that makes some sort of sense. It's part of my messy multilateralism point.
Agreed. Zishan?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Professor Martin, for your wonderful talk. I have two related questions. My first question is, do you think that the foreign aid from the multilateral development institutions have been effective for inclusive economic growth in developing countries? When I say inclusive, I mean that poverty reduction along with the economic growth. That is the first part of my question. My second part is, like, if you say that it had been effective, like, how can you quantify it if you have to measure it? Like, was it, like, you think, can you give us a rough number? Like, was it 50% effective or 100% effective or 20% effective?
I couldn't quite catch the second part, the start of your second question. Could you just repeat that?
Let me repeat it. What he's saying is that basically, how can we measure the effectiveness of aid?
Okay.
Has aid effective in creating inclusive development?
Yeah.
Second part is, how do we measure it? Is it possible to quantify the effect of aid?
Well, I'm very conscious that I'm a historian speaking to people who are developed economists who are much more expert at this than I am. So I think that in the history that I'm looking at, I think those questions are being asked repeatedly. I think it goes back to Robert McNamara at the World Bank when, of course, a Pakistani economist came in. Was it to develop the Human Development Index? So there's a whole issue here about what is the best measurement to be utilised. The various indicators that have been developed by the IMF, by the World Bank. So that's trying to measure how effective this all is. I think that the role of the World Bank actually is to try to measure the effectiveness of foreign aid, and it's not just coming from these global institutions. It must also be about the aid being provided by national governments and by bodies like the Gates Foundation and so on. Trying to provide those measurements, I think, is vitally important. But what I would also like to pick up here is that I was talking about the way in which the development of open markets was harming, so it was seen, people within the global north. The squeeze upon the working people and the squeezed middle class. Now, of course, their standard of living is still usually higher than that of emerging markets, but that is also an issue which goes back to what I was saying about the need to rebalance domestic economies within the global north as well. I think that looking at it from the Branko Milanovic sort of elephant curve type argument, one has to realize that a large part of the gain from globalization in the late years of the last century and early years of this century was going to the global south. And although, of course, the income levels of the global south remain below that of the global north, you could then get the backlash in the global north against that. And I think that sitting as I do in the global north, I think there's a serious risk that what is happening on this part of the world can then undermine the commitment to having a fairer, juster international global system. So I think that we need to look at it both from the point of view within the global north and in the global south. I was focusing upon the need to restructure the situation here within Britain, the United States of America, because without that, there won't be the expansion of global trade, and which might then help emerging markets. And you also have the risk of the warfare, both hot warfare and trade warfare, with with China that we were talking about earlier on. So I don't know if that begins to have some sort of answered your question.
Fair point, sir. Ahmed Durrani, last question.
Yes, Professor Martin, thank you very much for your it was very nice lecture. I haven't read your book. What I would like to ask you may sound very esoteric, but I think as a historian, maybe you can actually just comment on it. The thing I take from all these questions and answers in your lecture is that in this world where you deal with plurilateralism as opposed to multilateralism, there is imminent death of the nation state, the concept of the 19th century that really we have been promoting. So when Dr. Nadeem says something about an independence of a nation to go and counter a multilateral system, I'm a little lost because, and here's my question, because the underlying agreement, I mean, the COP is an amazing example of a show and tell. Today, I will happen to be in a local hotel, 5 different conferences on water, on this, on that, you name it. This bureaucracy that Dr. Saab says is very omnipresent and drives agendas. But I find missing, and I have to, sort of let you know that I worked 20 years in the World Bank, and I say this after some learning. The underlying agreement to sustain humanity, or if I put it more simply, the underlying agreement to sustain life is missing while we try to sustain the planet, we try to sustain free trade, we try to sustain rights of, individual rights as opposed to collective consensus of human beings. So isn't that where historically, if you were to look at it, we are running out of models that were framed since Adam Smith from, I'm not a trained economist, but I have read all the books. And I would like to challenge, if we are not in need of a new model, if we are to survive as humans, and whatever that means to be humans, because somebody's going to define that. It's not about morality. It's about the survival of a species to which you and I belong, my children belong. There is no agreement around the globe, whether through plurilateralism or through this. It's all about growth. The story is about growth, about poverty, about this and that. It seems to me like the moment you're not poor, you will sustain life. So that's my posit to you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I agree with you completely on that. I suppose it goes back to what was said in the first question about Keynes. We need another Keynes. We need a new paradigm. And I think that one of the problems about Keynes in the 1930s, he was not really concerned about the environment. He was concerned, I think, with the short term. He never really talked very much about the long term. The book I'm just finishing reading at the moment is a new book by Dieter Helm, which is called Legacy. And in that, he's arguing that we need to get away from measures of growth by GDP and instead think about what we are handing on to the next generation in terms of natural capital and public goods. And that would be a major change. He points out in the book, and I think Partha Gupta does as well, that if one looks at China's development in terms of destruction of environment and natural resources, then perhaps one doesn't have growth at all. One could think also about Brazil and the Amazon rainforest. So what has been argued in Dieter Helm's book is that the major concern of economists should be how do we hand to the next generation assets which are as good as what we've received from the previous generation, and that would require a fundamentally different way of looking at the world economy. I think that also has a historical element in it, because of course Britain started the whole process of depleting natural resources and polluting the environment back in the Industrial Revolution. So there ought to be some payment of compensation by the current developed world to other countries for how we have destroyed the natural environment. So I think if one starts to think in those terms, one has a fundamentally different way of proceeding. One point that I was making in my book was that there was a debate over those issues by people who were at the conference at Hot Springs in 1943, which led to the setting up of the Food and Agricultural Organization. A lot of the people involved in there were concerned about the destruction of the soil, the destruction of ecology. People like John Boyd Orr in particular. So one could say that part of the story that I'm telling is how we went down the wrong route of a constant striving for ever more growth of the GDP rather than looking at these wider issues.
Here's a final question. As you said, that we have kind of circled back to the pre-1914 situation, that there are many, many sparks that are possible to ignite right now. So do we learn from history, or is history a constant cycle, as they say?
I'm not sure if it's a cycle. I think what we learn from history is how to analyze questions. It's a mode of thinking, if you like. I think as historians, what we like to do is to analyze the complexities of what is happening at any one time, the contingencies. Obviously, there are some structural factors behind it all, but I think that it's a mode of analysis. Say, we might think, well, yeah, there's something a bit like 1914. We might think about there are flashpoints, but there are different flashpoints. The problems of the weakening of the Ottoman Empire are slightly different from the problems we have today from a weakening of the American Empire, or the. So I think we need to understand the way in which, to some extent, we're path dependent. There are path dependencies, of course, which happen, but also about agencies. What will trigger a shift in the path dependency? So that's what I try to do in my work as a historian, is to say there are certain things which have happened because history has happened in that way, that institutions have been created, like the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. They emerge at a particular juncture in 1944 or GATT in 1947. Those institutions were set up in response to particular contingencies. Right. So they exist. They have their bureaucracies, which you argued about in your first comment. So we're trapped in that path dependency until at some point something happens to shift it off that particular track of development. So as a historian, we have to say, well, what would then lead to that sudden shift? That could be a natural disaster, the Black Death, or COVID, or something of that sort. It could be an exogenous factor, like a world war. It could be a protest movement coming from within a country. So I think what we're trying to argue is about how does that relationship between structure and agency change over time. So I think I would say that we're in a situation like now more like 1914 than it was in the 1950s, in a sense that we don't have a stable balance between two great powers. It's based upon a much more fractured and therefore dangerous world, but dangerous in its own particular way.
So would you agree with Steven Pinker that we are a much more civilized people than we used to be? That we are.
Well, he argued that violence has decreased, does he not? I'm not so sure about that. I don't see us becoming more civilized. I think we remain more violent in slightly different ways.
Great. Thank you, Professor Staunton. That is very nice. We are going to use your book in our courses. And thank
Good.
you for giving a very good
Well,
synopsis.
And thank you very much for all your questions coming from a very much more present centric position than mine. So I hope that historians and development economists can continue to learn from each other. So thank you very much.
We'll ask you now and again to come and enlighten us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All of you have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.